By the beginning of 1944, the Eastern Front had undergone a fundamental shift. The Wehrmacht's summer 1943 defeat at Kursk, followed by successive Soviet advances in Ukraine and along the central sector, had left Army Group Center in an increasingly precarious position. German forces in Belarus held a salient extending eastward, anchored on cities such as Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk, and Minsk. This salient, created by earlier offensives, was now exposed on both its northern and southern flanks. For Germany, the sector was held by approximately 850,000 troops of Army Group Center under Field Marshal Ernst Busch. These forces were organized into four armies: the 3rd Panzer Army in the north, the 4th Army in the central sector, the 9th Army to the south, and the 2nd Army. German intelligence assessments acknowledged the possibility of Soviet operations in Belarus, but underestimated both the scale and the timing of the coming offensive. The Soviet Union, under the direction of the Stavka, aimed to liberate Belarus and destroy Army Group Center. The operation was part of a broader strategic plan to clear German forces from Soviet territory, link up with offensives in Ukraine and the Baltic, and push toward Poland and East Prussia. The main Soviet effort would be undertaken by the First Baltic Front, General Hovhannes Bagration, the Third Belarusian Front, General Ivan Chernyakhovsky, the Second Belarusian Front, General Georgy Zakharov, and the First Belarusian Front, Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky. Collectively, these forces numbered over 2.3 million personnel, supported by more than 5,200 tanks and self-propelled guns, 30,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and around 5,300 aircraft. The geopolitical stakes were high. The German hold on Belarus threatened Soviet lines of communication between the central and northern fronts and provided the Wehrmacht with a defensive shield for East Prussia and Poland. For the Soviets, the liberation of Belarus would also be politically significant, both for morale and as a demonstration to the Allies of the Red Army's ability to conduct large-scale coordinated operations across multiple fronts. In the months leading to summer 1944, Soviet partisans in Belarus intensified sabotage operations, particularly targeting the railway network. Known collectively as the Rail War, these actions disrupted German troop movements and supply lines, reducing the capacity of Army Group Center to reinforce threatened sectors. At the same time, Soviet deception operations, Maskirovka, were implemented on a vast scale. False troop concentrations, fake radio traffic, and misleading operational security measures were used to convince the Germans that the main Soviet effort would come further south in Ukraine, not in Belarus. Public sentiment in occupied Belarus reflected years of German occupation marked by harsh reprisals, forced labor, and economic exploitation. Many rural areas were under de facto partisan control, while cities remained under strict German administration. This social and political environment contributed to the Soviet expectation that advancing troops would be aided by local resistance movements, further undermining German control during the coming offensive. By June 1944, both sides had positioned their forces for a decisive clash. The Germans believed they faced localized Soviet offensives, while the Red Army prepared one of the largest operations in modern military history. The stage was set for a coordinated four-front assault that would change the strategic balance on the Eastern Front and lead to the destruction of an entire German army group in the field. In the early hours of 22nd June 1944, exactly 3 years after the launch of Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet Union opened Operation Bagration with a massive preparatory bombardment across a front stretching over 1,000 kilometers. Soviet artillery units, numbering more than 30,000 pieces of various calibers, concentrated their fire on German forward positions, command posts, supply dumps, and artillery batteries. This preparatory fire lasted up to 2 hours in some sectors, combining conventional shelling with the sudden use of Katyusha multiple rocket launchers to disorient and suppress the defenders. The German Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Ernst Busch, was deployed in a forward defense posture with limited operational reserves. Many German divisions were understrength, averaging between 6,000 and 8,000 men, far below their nominal establishment of over 15,000. Defensive lines were manned by a combination of infantry divisions, fortress battalions, and static security units, with armor concentrated in a few mobile reserves. Due to Soviet deception measures, German commanders still believed the main Soviet summer offensive would occur in Ukraine, leading them to underestimate the scale of the assault in Belarus. The Soviet attack began simultaneously in the sectors of the First Baltic Front, the Third Belarusian Front, and the First Belarusian Front, with the Second Belarusian Front joining shortly afterward. Infantry spearheads, closely supported by tanks and self-propelled guns, advanced behind rolling artillery barrages designed to suppress German fire and keep the defenders pinned until the moment of assault. Soviet air forces, including over 5,000 aircraft from the 1st and 16th Air Armies, executed concentrated strikes against rail junctions, bridges, and retreat routes to isolate the German front line. On the first day, Soviet forces achieved significant penetrations in several sectors. In the north, near Vitebsk, the First Baltic Front's attacks threatened to encircle the German 3rd Panzer Army's forward elements. In the center, the 3rd Belarusian Front's push toward Orsha began to break through the 4th Army's main defensive belt, while in the south, the 1st Belarusian Front's assault near Bobruisk strained the 9th Army's ability to maintain a continuous front. German countermeasures were hampered by disrupted communications, the destruction of bridges and supply depots, and the difficulty of moving reserves under constant Soviet air attack. Attempts to mount local counterattacks with available armor often failed due to the depth and width of the Soviet breakthroughs, forcing German units into hasty retreats to secondary positions. By the end of 23rd June, it was evident that the Soviet offensive was not a limited local operation, but a coordinated, deep penetration assault aimed at the destruction of Army Group Center. The speed of the advance and the collapse of multiple defensive sectors signaled the beginning of a large-scale encirclement battle that would define the coming weeks of fighting in Belarus. By 24 June 1944, the full scope of the Soviet plan for Operation Bagration became apparent in its execution. The simultaneous multi-front assaults had broken through the German forward defensive zones in multiple places, leaving Army Group Center struggling to form cohesive secondary lines. The Soviet advance was spearheaded by shock armies and tank corps, exploiting the breaches before the Germans could establish a solid defense. In the north, the First Baltic Front moved rapidly toward Vitebsk, where 4 German divisions were in danger of encirclement. Soviet infantry and armor cut key roads and railways, while partisan units disrupted remaining lines of communication behind German positions. Attempts to evacuate German forces from Vitebsk were delayed by conflicting orders from higher command, as Hitler insisted that the city be held at all costs, preventing timely withdrawals. In the central sector, the Third Belarusian Front directed its main effort toward Orsha and the vital Minsk-Moscow highway. The 5th Guards Tank Army and supporting rifle formations breached German positions held by elements of the 4th Army, penetrating up to 25 kilometers in some areas within 2 days. The collapse of the Orsha defensive belt threatened to open the road west to Minsk, the primary logistical hub for Army Group Center. In the south, the 1st Belarusian Front attacked along the Bobruisk axis against the 9th Army. Here, heavy Soviet artillery preparation, coupled with coordinated armor infantry assaults, broke through the first defensive line and enveloped German forward units. By the end of 25 June, several German infantry divisions were partially encircled, forcing the commitment of scarce armored reserves in counterattacks that achieved only limited tactical success. German mobility was increasingly restricted by the destruction of bridges and constant air harassment. The Soviet Air Force maintained overwhelming presence over the battlefield, interdicting reinforcements and striking retreating columns. Luftwaffe efforts to counter this were minimal, as only a fraction of available aircraft could be committed due to shortages of fuel and operational aircraft. By the close of June's first phase, the German front in Belarus was fragmenting. Soviet forces had created multiple pockets and widened their penetrations, while maintaining the pace of operations to prevent the enemy from establishing a coherent defense. The initial objective of shattering the first and second defensive lines had been achieved ahead of schedule, setting the stage for deep exploitation toward the operational heart of Army Group Center. By 26th of June 1944, Soviet forces deepened their advances across the breadth of the Belarusian front, moving beyond the initial tactical breakthroughs into operational-level encirclements. The First Baltic Front, advancing on Vitebsk, completed its envelopment of the German 53rd Corps, trapping 4 divisions. Despite repeated orders from Hitler to hold the city, German attempts at breakout failed under constant Soviet pressure and artillery fire. By the evening of 27th of June, organized resistance in Vitebsk had collapsed, resulting in the capture or destruction of nearly 30,000 German troops in this sector alone. South of Vitebsk, the Third Belarusian Front exploited its breakthrough toward Orsha. The capture of this strongpoint on 27 June severed one of the main east-west transport routes in Belarus, including the critical Moscow-Minsk highway. Orsha's fall not only eliminated a major defensive hub, but also removed the last prepared position in front of the approaches to Minsk from the north. Soviet armor and mechanized units began to pour through the gap, bypassing isolated German units to maintain momentum. In the Bobruisk sector, the First Belarusian Front executed a large double envelopment of German forces. The 65th and 28th Armies advanced from the north and south, linking up east of the city on 27 June and encircling the bulk of the German 9th Army's forward elements. Within the pocket, German troops faced relentless Soviet artillery bombardment and air attacks that disrupted any organized withdrawal. By the end of the month, more than 40,000 German soldiers in this sector were either killed or captured, representing a devastating blow to Army Group Center's southern flank. German command efforts to stabilize the front were undermined by multiple factors: the rapid pace of Soviet exploitation, the destruction of key bridges and supply depots by air and partisan action, and rigid no-retreat directives from the highest levels. With communication lines fragmented, corps and divisional commanders often acted in isolation, unable to coordinate counterattacks or withdrawals effectively. By 28 June, the operational picture for Army Group Center was critical. The destruction of the Vitebsk and Bobruisk groupings had removed two major defensive anchors. Soviet forces, supported by mobile exploitation groups of tank and cavalry mechanized formations, now pushed toward the Berezina River, aiming to cut off and annihilate additional German formations retreating toward Minsk. The second phase of Operation Bagration, deep encirclements, and the destruction of the main body of Army Group Center was now fully underway. By 29 June 1944, Soviet forces were driving westward in multiple converging axes, seeking to trap the remaining large formations of Army Group Center before they could retreat beyond the Berezina River. The destruction of the Vitebsk and Bobruisk pockets had freed up additional rifle divisions, tank corps, and mechanized units to be redirected into the main thrust toward Minsk. This rapid redeployment of entire armies was facilitated by the Soviet mastery of operational logistics, bridging destroyed crossings overnight, moving artillery by rail and road to forward positions, and sustaining the advance with an uninterrupted flow of fuel and ammunition from the rear. In the north, the Third Belarusian Front continued pushing along the Minsk-Moscow highway, with the 5th Guards Tank Army and 11th Guards Army making deep penetrations into German-held territory. German rearguard actions, often fought by hastily assembled Kampfgruppen, attempted to delay the Soviet armor, but these forces were too few and too dispersed to halt the momentum. The collapse of cohesive defensive lines forced German units into fragmented withdrawals through forested and marshy terrain, where Soviet pursuit units, often supported by local partisan detachments, harassed them relentlessly. In the southern sector, the First Belarusian Front had broken into open country beyond Bobruisk, with its mobile groups advancing 40-60 kilometers in just 2 days. The 2nd Guards Tank Corps and attached mechanized brigades bypassed centers of resistance, leaving these to be dealt with by following infantry. This operational method allowed the Soviets to maintain continuous forward movement while preventing German forces from re-establishing defensive depth. The Berezina River line, long considered a potential fallback position by German planners, was under immediate threat. Soviet air forces concentrated on destroying river crossings and interdicting retreat routes. Over the course of 29-30 June, bomber and ground attack aircraft destroyed dozens of bridges and ferries, forcing German columns into bottlenecks where they were vulnerable to concentrated artillery and airstrikes. The Luftwaffe's capacity to contest Soviet air superiority was negligible. Fuel shortages and the dispersal of fighter units meant that German air cover was sporadic at best. Command decisions in the German High Command reflected the growing crisis. On 28 June, Hitler dismissed Field Marshal Busch and appointed Field Marshal Walter Model to command Army Group Center. Model was known for his skill in defensive operations, but he took command at a moment when much of his force was already in disarray. His immediate orders emphasized holding the Berezina line and extracting trapped formations, but the pace of the Soviet advance left little room to implement such measures before further encirclements could be executed. By the end of June, the Red Army's operational objectives were clearly within reach. The destruction of successive German strongpoints had opened the path to Minsk, and the Soviet timetable, originally projecting the encirclement of the city in early July, was already ahead of schedule. For Army Group Center, the immediate danger was not merely the loss of Belarusian territory, but the annihilation of its combat strength in the field. The next phase of Operation Bagration would determine whether any substantial German forces could escape westward to regroup. By 1 July 1944, the Soviet advance had reached the outer approaches to Minsk, with multiple spearheads converging from the north, east, and south. The 3rd Belarusian Front's mobile groups, particularly the 5th Guards Tank Army, drove through minimal opposition along the Minsk-Borisov axis after securing crossings over the Berezina River. In some cases, improvised Soviet pontoon bridges were laid under fire to keep the pace of the offensive uninterrupted, allowing armor and mechanized infantry to bypass isolated German strongpoints still holding along the riverbanks. To the south, the 1st Belarusian Front pressed westward from Bobruisk, with its armored spearheads advancing over 50 kilometers in a single day toward Slutsk and Baranovichi. These movements cut off retreat routes for German forces attempting to fall back from the eastern bank of the Berezina. The 28th and 65th Armies, advancing on parallel axes, intercepted columns of the German 9th Army, inflicting heavy casualties in a series of running battles. Soviet artillery, brought forward at speed, shelled retreating units at road junctions, while partisan detachments blocked forest tracks and secondary roads, further tightening the encirclement. In the northern sector, the 1st Baltic Front closed in on Molodechno, threatening to sever connections between Army Group Center and Army Group North. German formations in this area were already reduced to Kampfgruppen, ad hoc battle groups comprised of remnants from several divisions, lacking heavy weapons and with only limited anti-tank capability. The absence of strong reserves meant that every sector under attack had to rely on static defensive positions, which were rapidly bypassed by Soviet mechanized forces. German attempts to re-establish a coherent defensive line along the Berezina were hampered not only by Soviet pressure, but by shortages in fuel, ammunition, and transport. Many heavy weapons had to be abandoned due to lack of towing vehicles. Luftwaffe support was largely ineffective, as Soviet air superiority ensured that any German sorties faced immediate interception. The few successful German air missions were insufficient to alter the operational situation. On 2 July, Soviet forward detachments began encircling Minsk from both the north and south. The 2nd Guards Tank Corps drove from the southeast toward Stolpcy, while elements of the 3rd Guards Mechanized Corps struck from the northeast. By the evening, the last major escape routes westward for German forces east of Minsk were either in Soviet hands or under direct artillery observation. The tightening of the encirclement around Minsk signaled the imminent destruction of the largest remaining concentration of Army Group Center's combat strength. For the Soviets, this marked the culmination of the operational exploitation phase of Bagration, where rapid movement and deep penetrations had bypassed strong points and trapped entire armies. For the Germans, it was a desperate struggle to keep open corridors for retreat while under relentless pressure from all sides, with every hour reducing the possibility of an organized withdrawal. By 3rd of July 1944, the Soviet encirclement of Minsk was complete. The 2nd Guards Tank Corps from the southeast and the 5th Guards Tank Army from the northeast linked up west of the city, sealing the pocket. Inside the encirclement were the remnants of the German 4th Army and elements of the 9th Army, over 100,000 troops in total, trapped in an area with limited supplies, almost no heavy equipment, and minimal coordination between units. Soviet forces immediately shifted to containment and reduction of the pocket. Infantry formations of the 11th Guards Army and the 31st Army closed in from the east, while mechanized and cavalry units patrolled the western perimeter to prevent breakouts. Artillery units were positioned to cover all major roads, and Soviet aircraft conducted continuous sorties to disrupt any attempts to move by day. German troops resorted to night movements through forests and fields, but these efforts often encountered Soviet patrols or partisan detachments familiar with the terrain. Within the city of Minsk, German rearguards attempted to delay the Soviet entry, but their positions were thinly held. By the morning of 3rd of July, forward detachments of the 3rd Belarusian Front entered the city from multiple directions. Street fighting was sporadic and short-lived. Most German defenders either surrendered or attempted to escape westward through the already sealed ring. By midday, Minsk was firmly under Soviet control, marking a significant symbolic and operational victory. The focus then shifted to eliminating the large German force trapped east of the city. Over the next 5 days, Soviet armies pressed the pocket from all sides. Constant artillery fire, combined with close-range infantry assaults, steadily reduced the area under German control. Food and ammunition shortages rapidly degraded the defenders' ability to resist. With no hope of relief, Army Group Center's remaining forces were too scattered and weakened to attempt a breakout. Organized resistance collapsed by 8th of July. The result was one of the largest encirclements of the Eastern Front since Stalingrad. Soviet forces claimed over 72,000 prisoners and tens of thousands of German dead in the Minsk pocket. The loss of these formations effectively destroyed the combat capability of Army Group Center. For the Soviets, the destruction of such a large enemy force opened the way to deep advances into western Belarus, Poland, and the Baltic states. For the Germans, it marked a decisive and irrecoverable defeat on the central sector of the Eastern Front. Following the fall of Minsk, Soviet forces wasted no time in transitioning to the next phase of Operation Bagration, exploitation into western Belarus and the approaches to Poland. The destruction of the German 4th Army and much of the 9th Army in the Minsk pocket had left a vast gap in the front, which the Red Army sought to widen before the Germans could bring in reserves from other sectors. Mobile formations, particularly the 2nd Guards Tank Corps, 5th Guards Tank Army, and elements of the 3rd Guards Mechanized Corps, pushed forward on multiple axes toward Baranovichi, Lida, and Vilnius. The 1st Baltic Front advanced rapidly north of Minsk, aiming to cut off German forces retreating toward Vilnius and Kaunas. The 6th Guards Army supported by the 2nd Guards Tank Corps, advanced over 100 kilometers in less than a week, bypassing pockets of resistance and leaving these for following infantry units to clear. In many areas, German rearguards were composed of fragmented Kampfgruppen formed from logistics units, security battalions, and small numbers of survivors from shattered divisions. In the south, the First Belarusian Front moved toward Baranovichi, a key rail hub connecting eastern and western Belarus. Control of this junction was essential for maintaining operational momentum toward Brest and the Vistula River. By mid-July, the front's tank and mechanized corps had enveloped the city from north and south, forcing its evacuation by the German garrison after only brief resistance. The German command under Field Marshal Model attempted to stabilize the front by creating a defensive line along the Neman River in the north and the Shara River in the center. However, these positions were improvised and lacked the depth and fortification of earlier defensive belts. The Wehrmacht's ability to hold them was further undermined by continued partisan activity, which disrupted communications and destroyed bridges, complicating the movement of reinforcements. Soviet air superiority, established early in the operation, continued to play a decisive role. Fighter bombers struck at road and rail movements behind German lines, while bombers targeted concentrations of troops in assembly areas. These air operations not only slowed German withdrawal, but also helped Soviet ground units maintain pressure without allowing the enemy time to regroup. By late July, Soviet forces had reached the borders of pre-war Poland and Lithuania. The capture of Vilnius and Lida in the north and Baranovichi in the south marked the completion of another phase of the offensive. With the German front collapsing along its entire length in the central sector, the Red Army was now poised to advance toward the Vistula and prepare for operations into East Prussia. In early August 1944, the operational momentum of Operation Bagration began to intersect with the limits of Soviet logistical capacity, but the Red Army still pushed forward to exploit the collapse of Army Group Center. The fronts that had liberated Belarus were now operating deep in former Polish and Lithuanian territory, aiming to secure bridgeheads over major rivers and prevent the Wehrmacht from establishing a stable defensive line. In the north, the First Baltic Front pressed toward the city of Kaunas and the approaches to East Prussia. The 6th Guards Army and 43rd Army advanced steadily, despite encountering stronger resistance from German forces brought in from Army Group North. These formations included remnants of panzer divisions refitted with a limited number of operational tanks, often fewer than 40 per division, and reinforced by Volksgrenadier units rushed from Germany. While these measures slowed the Soviet pace, they could not halt it entirely. By 1st August, Kaunas was isolated, and Soviet forward detachments were probing the East Prussian border. In the center, the Third Belarusian Front's advance toward the Neman River forced the Germans into a fighting withdrawal, attempting to hold key crossings near Grodno. Here, Soviet bridgeheads were established under heavy artillery fire, often using pontoon equipment moved forward in stages through congested roads. Once crossings were secured, tank and mechanized units pushed through to widen the lodgements, threatening to envelop German positions along the river line. To the south, The First Belarusian Front advanced on Brest, the last major fortress city before the Bug River. The garrison, reinforced by elements retreating from Baranovichi, constructed layered defenses and attempted to delay the Soviet approach through counterattacks and demolition of key infrastructure. The Soviets responded with concentrated artillery bombardments and methodical infantry assaults, supported by armor in urban sectors where maneuver was possible. By mid-August, Brest was under siege, with Soviet troops tightening their grip on the surrounding area. German strategic withdrawals during this phase were more orderly than in the earlier stages of Bagration, but the losses in men and materiel were irreplaceable. Even as defensive lines in front of East Prussia and the Vistula were forming, the Wehrmacht's central sector remained thinly held. Soviet planners were aware of this and began preparing for the next phase of operations, which would involve coordinated offensives toward Warsaw and Königsberg. For both sides, August represented a transition. For the Soviets, from high-speed deep operations to consolidation and preparation for new offensives. For the Germans, from collapse to a desperate attempt at strategic defense. The destruction of Army Group Center in Belarus had redrawn the front lines of the Eastern Front, but the campaign was not yet concluded. By late August 1944, the operational phase of Operation Bagration was formally concluded, though localized fighting and clearing operations continued into September. The Soviet advance had liberated nearly all of Belarus, large portions of eastern Poland, and parts of Lithuania, pushing the front line up to the borders of East Prussia and the Vistula River. The scale of the operation's outcome was unprecedented in the Eastern Front's history. Army Group Center had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force, with estimates of over 400,000 German personnel killed, wounded, or captured. The destruction included entire corps and divisions, along with enormous quantities of equipment, artillery, armored vehicles, and supply depots lost in place or destroyed during retreat. For the Soviets, the success of Bagration was a demonstration of the maturity of their operational art. The combination of deception operations, maskirovka, overwhelming artillery preparation, deep armored exploitation, and close air support produced an unbroken sequence of operational victories. The coordination between partisan forces and regular armies was also a significant factor, with thousands of rail demolitions and bridge destructions disrupting German logistics in the weeks before and during the offensive. However, the campaign also revealed challenges for the advancing Red Army. The rapid forward movement stretched supply lines over hundreds of kilometers, making it difficult to bring forward sufficient fuel, ammunition, and food for the next phase of operations. In some areas, advances had to pause while engineers repaired roads and bridges, or while rear services reorganized transport. These delays allowed the Wehrmacht to begin constructing more solid defensive positions along the Nara River, in the approaches to Warsaw, and on the East Prussian frontier. For the Germans, the loss of Belarus not only represented a strategic catastrophe, but also exposed the vulnerability of their central front. The failure to anticipate the scale and direction of the Soviet main effort, coupled with rigid no-retreat orders, meant that large forces were committed to untenable positions and destroyed in place. The destruction of Army Group Center forced the German High Command to shift reserves from other critical theaters, including France and Italy, weakening their overall strategic posture. Internationally, Operation Bagration's success coincided with the Allied breakout from Normandy, creating a simultaneous collapse of German fronts in both east and west. The dual pressure strained German capacity to replace losses or mount effective counteroffensives. Soviet political leadership capitalized on the victory to strengthen its negotiating position with the Western Allies, emphasizing its role in the liberation of Eastern Europe. In historical perspective, the operation fundamentally changed the balance of power on the Eastern Front. It created the conditions for the Soviet advances into Poland, the Baltics, and ultimately toward Berlin. In Belarus, the destruction and loss of life during both the German occupation and the liberation left deep scars. Post-war reconstruction was immense in scale, and the memory of the operation became central to Belarusian wartime history. The combination of military decisiveness and political consequence ensured that Operation Bagration would be remembered as one of the most significant campaigns of the Second World War.